The year is 795 AD. On the northeastern coast of Ireland, a small island named Lambai rises from the Irish Sea, like a green jewel surrounded by grey stone. Perched on its cliffs, a stone convent houses 42 women who have dedicated their lives to God. Sister Brieg, the abbess, is 63 years old. She has governed this convent for 27 years, long before most of the younger sisters were even born. Her hands, hardened by years of copying manuscripts in the flickering candlelight, tremble slightly as she holds the illuminated gospel she spent 3 years completing. It's the feast day of St. Columba, June 6th. The sisters gather in the stone chapel for morning prayers. Their voices rise in Gregorian chant, reverberating against walls that have seen generations of women pray in this very place. Outside, the ocean is calm. The morning mist floats over the water like a veil. The chapel bell rings 6 times, signalling the hour of lauds. It's a sound these women have heard every morning throughout their monastic lives. What they don't know is that the bell is summoning more than just prayers. It is calling predators on the horizon, invisible through the fog. 3 ships glide silently through the waves. They are not merchant vessels, nor are they pilgrim boats. They are drakars, long Viking ships. Each one carries 30 Nordic warriors, men who have never heard of Christian mercy. This is the story of the first recorded Viking raid on Irish soil. A story that was written, then buried, and later forgotten for over 1,000 years. That is until 2003, when a manuscript was discovered in the archives of the Trinity College Library in Dublin. A diary written in medieval Latin by a monk named Kell, who visited Lambai 6 months after the attack. What he documented is not found in any history book you've studied. It was deliberately erased, hidden away, deemed too shameful to be preserved. But the words remained, waiting for centuries on yellowed pages. And now, finally, we can tell the full truth. Do you want to hear stories that were deliberately buried? Stories based on real documents that the official history chose to ignore? Subscribe now to Echoes of Cruelty. Leave a like, because what you're about to hear isn't an invention. It's the direct testimony of someone who witnessed the consequences with their own eyes. To understand what happened at Lambai that June day, you need to know who the Vikings were in 795 AD and where they came from. They weren't yet the organised conquerors who had found Dublin in 841, nor were they the sophisticated traders who had opened routes to Constantinople, bringing silk from China and silver from Arabia back to the Scandinavian fjords. Back then, they were something much more primitive, much more dangerous, and far more desperate. They were pagan warriors from the rocky coasts of Norway, men who worshipped Thor, the god of thunder, and Odin, the father of all. They believed that dying in battle with a weapon in hand was the only sure way to enter Valhalla, the hall of fallen warriors, where they would fight and feast for all eternity. They came from frozen fjords where life was brutal, short and relentless, where only the strongest, the cleverest, and the most ruthless survived. Winters often killed half the village from hunger and cold. Scandinavia, in 795, was not a land of abundance. It was a land of stone and ice where arable land was scarce, and 3 months of summer had to feed 12 months of hungry mouths. When the population grew beyond what the land could support, young men faced a simple choice: die of hunger at home or seek fortune across the sea. Many chose the sea. These men didn't know the Christian concept of mercy. Their religion had no commandments against killing. Their gods were warriors who resolved disputes with violence. Their sagas celebrated men who died fighting, not men who forgave their enemies. They had no theological prohibitions against killing non-combatants, enslaving prisoners, or raiding places of worship. To them, unprotected wealth was wealth waiting to be taken by anyone with the courage and strength to seize it. They didn't see monasteries and convents as sacred places protected by the Christian God. They saw them as undefended treasure troves, filled with gold and silver, guarded by people who had sworn never to fight. They saw them as perfect targets. Because the Irish monasteries of 795 were wealthy in ways that the impoverished Scandinavians could barely imagine. Centuries of donations from Irish kings, newly converted to Christianity, from nobles seeking to redeem their sins with generous offerings to the church, and from pilgrims leaving gifts at shrines, had filled these holy places with treasures that glittered in the candlelight. Golden chalices forged by master silversmiths and decorated with colourful enamels, silver reliquaries containing fragments of saints' bones embedded with amber from the Baltic and garnets from places as far away as India, illuminated manuscripts, each page taking weeks to complete, decorated with gold leaf so thin it was almost transparent, painted with rare pigments worth more than gold by weight, lapis lazuli brought from Persia, and purple dye extracted from Mediterranean snails, processional crosses so large that 2 men were needed to carry them, studded with precious stones, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and all these priceless treasures were guarded, protected by people who had taken sacred vows never to wield weapons, never to respond to violence with violence, and never to shed human blood under any circumstances. To the Vikings, men trained from childhood to fight, for whom violence wasn't just acceptable, but honourable. This was like finding a gold mine with no guards, defended only by sheep praying in a language they couldn't understand. The convent at Lambai was particularly vulnerable, even among already vulnerable targets. It was located on a small island, isolated from the Irish coast by 3 kilometres of often choppy sea. There were no nearby military garrisons or local kings with sworn warriors. There were no truly solid stone defensive walls, just the convent's walls, designed to keep the novices inside, not to keep invaders out. The sisters relied entirely on their holiness for protection, on the shared belief throughout Christendom that places dedicated to God were inviolate, that even the cruelest king would never dare to profane sacred ground for fear of eternal damnation. They truly believed, with a faith that had never been tested, that no one would dare attack women consecrated to Christ. Their prayers were a shield enough, that God would intervene miraculously, if necessary, to defend his servants. They were tragically, horribly wrong. Because the men rowing toward Lambai that June morning didn't believe in the Christian God. They didn't fear his wrath. They didn't recognize his authority over them or anything else. Kell, the monk who documented everything, wasn't in Lambai when it happened. He was at the monastery in Kells, 60 kilometers inland. But 6 months later, in December of 795, he was sent to Lambai to assess the damage and decide whether the convent could be rebuilt. What he found haunted him for the rest of his life. His manuscript, discovered in 2003 by Dr. Fergus Kelly, a medieval historian specialising in ancient Irish texts, had been catalogued incorrectly as generic religious sermons. For decades, no one had read beyond the first pages, but Dr. Kelly, searching for references to Viking attacks for his research, began to review the entire document. On page 47, he found something different. The Latin tone changed from sermon to testimony, and what was written there made Dr. Kelly stop breathing for a moment. Here is what he read. I arrived on the island of Lambai on the 12th day of December, in the year of our Lord 795. The sea was rough. The boatman who brought me refused to land. He said the island was cursed. The northern demons had profaned the sacred ground. I scolded him for his superstition and disembarked alone. Immediately, the smell hit me. 6 months had passed since the attack, but the air was still heavy with decay. I walked to the convent. The wooden doors were destroyed, torn from their hinges. The courtyard, where the sisters grew medicinal herbs, was overgrown with weeds. The chapel was open to the sky. Part of the roof had been burned from the inside. The pews were overturned, broken, and used as firewood. The stone altar was stained with something dark that I preferred not to identify. But what truly destroyed me was not the physical devastation, it was the silence. A convent, he wrote, is a place of human sounds. Footsteps in stone corridors, voices in prayer, the rustling of habits, the occasional laughter in the gardens where the younger sisters work. Lambai had only wind and the cries of seagulls squabbling over something on the cliffs. I found the first body in what remained of the dormitory. It was Sister Deidre. I identified her by the rings she still wore, marks of her life before the vows. She was 24 when she died. Selak didn't describe how she died, only wrote, "May God have mercy on her soul, and forgive us for failing to protect her." In the days that followed, I found more bodies, not 42, only 17. The others had simply disappeared. Selak interviewed nearby fishermen, people who had seen the Viking ships arrive. An old man named Con, who lived in a cottage on the cliffs of the mainland, described what he saw through the morning mist. 3 ships, he said, with dragon heads carved on their prows, gliding through the mist like ghosts. They didn't row to the shore. They anchored their boats and came ashore in smaller boats. 30 men, maybe more, tall with long hair and beards. They carried axes and round shields. Con said he heard the convent bell stop suddenly. Then he heard screams, followed by silence. The northern men stayed on the island the whole day, Con recalled. When they left at dusk, their ships were lower in the water, laden with what they had stolen. Selak asked him if he had seen the sisters being taken. The old man turned his gaze toward the sea. He fell silent for a long moment. Then he spoke with a trembling voice. "I saw some of them being taken to the ships. Their wrists were bound with ropes. They struggled, screamed, calling out to God and the saints. But the men from the north didn't listen to their cries. Some of the older sisters were left on the shore. They couldn't walk fast enough. The Norsemen didn't want them. I saw one of them, an elderly woman with completely white hair, fall to her knees and begin to pray aloud, raising her hands to the sky. One of the invaders laughed, raised his axe. Con stopped, shaking his head. I won't say the rest. Some horrors shouldn't be spoken aloud." Selak didn't press him to continue. He had already seen the bodies on the shore. He knew exactly what Con was reluctant to describe. The missing sisters hadn't died on that beach. They had been taken across the sea, transported in the Viking dracars back to Scandinavia, enslaved. For the Vikings, captured women were an incredibly valuable commodity in their economy, based on trade and raiding. They could be sold in large slave markets, in places like Nedevi, where the borders of modern-day Germany and Denmark meet, or in Birka in Sweden, or dozens of other ports where traders from across Europe and even the Arab world bought and sold human beings as if they were livestock. Young women, especially those considered attractive by Nordic standards, fair hair or red hair, pale skin, could fetch extremely high prices, sometimes equivalent to the value of a whole ship or an entire farm with land and animals. They could be bought by rich farmers from Norway or Sweden as forced wives, concubines, or domestic servants. They could be given as gifts or rewards to warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle, living trophies for their bravery. Or they could be kept by the invaders themselves, forced to perform domestic work on Scandinavian farms, cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, caring for animals, working from dawn to dusk, with no rest and no choice. The older women, those past marriageable age or considered less valuable because of their appearance, were generally killed outright, or they were sold at much lower prices for forced labour on farms or in mines. The specific fate of each captured woman depended on her age, her appearance, her health, and pure luck, on which Viking or chieftain claimed her as part of the spoils. There was no mercy in this system, no consideration for sacred vows or lives devoted to God. They were simply property, things to be used or sold according to the convenience of their captors. Selak interviewed another witness, a woman named Mørn, who lived on a farm near the coast. She saw something that Con hadn't. She said the Vikings came out of the convent carrying heavy sacks that clinked, gold and silver, from the church's relics. Others carried the illuminated manuscripts the sisters had created. They couldn't read them. but they knew they were valuable. Muan also saw the older sisters, the ones who couldn't walk fast enough. They were left on the shore. The Norsemen didn't want them. One of them, an elderly woman with completely white hair, fell to her knees and began to pray aloud. One of the invaders laughed. Muan stopped. Salak didn't make her continue. He had already seen the bodies. He knew what had happened. Salak's manuscript contains a detail that historians still debate to this day. He wrote that he found marks on the walls of the chapel, deep scratches on the stone made with something sharp. They weren't Viking symbols. They were words in Latin, barely legible, hurriedly carved. Misere nobis, ten misericordium nobis. Salak interpreted this as the last prayer of the sisters, carved while they waited for the invaders. But some modern historians suggest another possibility. Perhaps it was carved later by survivors who returned, trying to make sense of what had happened, or maybe by Salak himself, as a memorial to the women who never received a proper burial. In 2011, archaeologists from University College Dublin, led by Dr. Jovan Connor, a specialist in medieval Irish monastic sites, conducted systematic excavations on Lambai. At first, they were looking for evidence of Viking settlements from the late 9th century, but what they found was much older and much more disturbing. In a layer of soil dated by carbon-14 to around 795 AD, with a margin of error of about 10 years, they found extensive remains of burned structures. Charred wood that once formed roofs and beams, stones cracked by the intense heat of fires that had burned so fiercely they even melted some metals. Fragments of typical Irish pottery from the time. Bowls and jugs used in monastic refectories, many intentionally broken, not by the wear of everyday use, but by deliberate force, crushed under the boots of the invaders. Fragments of melted metal, which metallurgical analysis revealed once were religious objects made of bronze and silver. Chalices and patens, deformed beyond recognition by extreme heat. These were left behind because the Vikings only wanted precious metals, ones that could be easily melted down and reused. Not objects that required effort to process. And bones, 17 human skeletons, all determined through pelvic and cranial analysis to be female, all showing unmistakable signs of violent trauma at the time of death, or immediately before. Skulls fractured by blows from heavy objects, fractures consistent with Viking axes hacking through bone.